Thank you so much for that. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Alex.
Okay, so next up, we have Tave Cole, and Tave Cole is a drug user advocate and member of the Toronto Overdose Prevention Society. In her role as a harm reduction coordinator at Parkdale Queen West Community Health Center, she works in solidarity with individuals impacted by the war on drugs, homelessness, and the criminalization of sex work. She dreams of a day when harmful, ineffective, racist, colonial state structures crumble and a more just society has the opportunity to grow out of those remains. Looking forward to hear you speak, Tave. Go for it.
Hi. Thank you. My bio was so dramatic. I liked it. Okay, I'm really tired and stressed out, so forgive me if I don't make as much sense as maybe I would on another day, but it is what it is. So I'm mostly going to be talking about policing of homeless and drug-using folks that I encounter in my work. My role is coordinating a needle exchange at a community health center in Toronto and Parkdale. And usually I'm also doing like groups and programs with sex workers and folks who use drugs, but since the onset of COVID, we're not able to gather, so those aren't happening so much. So my role has been more about like just trying to meet people's basically food access needs and doing support as I can over the phone. So in the area that I work in, the homeless population is like very disproportionately Indigenous men, just to name that from the get-go. And I'm not sure how familiar folks on the call are with Toronto, how many people are here, but our shelter system is like totally overrun and totally fucked like on a baseline level. There's more than 7,000 people utilizing the shelter and respite systems in Toronto. And there's been no official order from Toronto's medical officer of health, Eileen Davila, to impose the 2 meter, 6 feet physical distancing within the shelter and respite systems. So folks are sleeping on cots like less than 3 feet apart from each other and often in bunk beds. And there's currently, as far as I can tell, as of yesterday, there's 211 reported cases, positive COVID cases in the shelter system within 9 different shelters throughout the city. So it's a mess, and the city hasn't coordinated testing in the shelters. It started to happen, but sort of like on the initiative of different hospitals and different health agencies. It's like very much not a coordinated Toronto public health effort that's happening. So, oh, another thing is the like intake, the physical space where folks could go for an intake to find a shelter bed is now closed. So you have to have a phone basically to like wait on hold forever to maybe get a shelter bed. So it's like, it's even more difficult than usual, which was already like, it was already really difficult to get a shelter bed. So obviously it's not working for a lot of folks, and many people are choosing to like take care of themselves and take care of their people by setting up outdoors and camping. So we've seen these like encampments all around the city in different neighborhoods. And yeah, it's like, it just makes good sense rather than being crammed in like a gymnasium or like a warehouse type space with no walls on cots 2 feet away from everyone. People have opted for this better option. And there's lots of good work happening out of the encampments. People are distributing harm reduction supplies to their communities out of the encampments. People are like really doing great work at looking out for each other and taking good care of each other. And up until this week, there was a moratorium from the city on bylaw officers evicting encampments, but that unfortunately changed as of Wednesday. The city of Toronto put out, they put out a media release, and they've got these 2 apartment buildings that are slated for demolition that they're moving people into on a temporary basis. And because they like have this option now, they are going to go ahead and already have started going ahead with clearing the encampments where people have found safety. So this is obviously an issue for a number of reasons. People are like in the neighborhoods where they're most comfortable, where their like support systems are, close to their pharmacies, close to their families, close to their friends, close to where they get food. And this expectation that everyone just like packs up and goes into these buildings sourced by the city for like 4 to 6 months. And then what happens after that, like they don't know. There's no guarantee that there will be housing beyond that point. So it's like a very good option for folks who want to do it. And there's for sure folks that are excited about it, but it's not for everyone. So yeah, I feel really worried about the end of this moratorium on the bylaw officers clearing the camps. But even while that was happening, we were definitely seeing an increase of police harassment of individuals in the camps. These get tracked. I'm sure there's way more that like I'm totally unaware of, but there's a weekly call amongst harm reduction agencies all around Toronto, and we have a Google Doc, and we all add to it the reports that we hear from individuals about police harassment. So I have like a bunch of examples I pulled just from the month of April that I'll share a couple with you. It's not so much, it hasn't been so much these like emergency measures tickets that people are getting, but it's a lot of like, it's like congregating or drinking in public. There's reports of police harassment of folks tenting every 15 minutes and warning of tickets if people don't leave. Open container tickets. One I witnessed personally was police come and they were giving tickets for open containers, and then they said that they could give trespass tickets, but they were using their discretion and they were choosing not to, but they wanted people to leave that space by the next time they came by. I also witnessed them handcuffing a young Indigenous man who didn't want to show ID because he was not committing a crime. He was actually picking up litter around the encampment and had a beer can, an empty beer can, and he was handcuffed and then ticketed for having an open container. And yeah, so I do know one of the agencies in the east end of Toronto Sanctuary who's doing really awesome work right now. They were helping a lot of their clients to move into these buildings that just became available. And the report I heard from workers there were that like as folks were packing up, the park ambassadors and bylaw officers were like present on the scene and just like really like clearing people's stuff away, like as they were just trying to vacate the space. So there's certainly been an increase of harassment of homeless people during this time. It's really gross. And then something that has come out of it is a colleague of mine, Liam Michaud, has been working really hard preparing like legal documents and like liaising with lawyers to get accurate info. And they've just put out this Know Your Rights document that I can share in the chat. And Neighborhood Legal Services in Toronto is asking folks to keep track of the tickets and submit them, and they're going to follow up with folks after the fact. One of the cops that I witnessed giving a ticket for an open container in an encampment said after that, he was like, all these tickets are just going to get thrown out after the crisis. Like, these tickets don't mean anything. But it's just like you're ticketing a bunch of folks who may not necessarily like have the capacity at that time to challenge them, may not have a phone, can't necessarily like, you know, follow through with challenging the ticket. So it does become more of an issue for them. Yeah, that's about it. It sucks extra for homeless people right now.
Thank you for that, Tave, and appreciate you sharing all of that. If people have questions for Tave, put them in the chat and we can ask them at the end. And Shane, I guess you answered that question, Shane, about the Blaine Higgs comment in the chat. So that's great. Thank you for that. Next, I'm going to invite Meenakshi Mannoe, who currently works at as the criminalization and policy campaigner at Pivot Legal Society. She's also a member of Stark Raven, a media collective that produces a monthly show about issues impacting prisoners, and the Vancouver Prisoners Justice Day Committee as well. Meenakshi, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm really grateful to follow Tave because I feel like we're kind of seeing parallel, like very parallel systems operating here. So I'm joining the call from unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories in what's called Vancouver. And I just am really appreciative of joining the call because I've found a lot of the framing and analysis here to be helpful as I try and think through the impact of the pandemic. My comments are going to focus on work that I'm doing through Pivot, but I also want to name that I've been involved in other anti-carceral, feminist, and prison justice organizing, and I feel really accountable to those movements and try to minimize the impact of the nonprofit industrial complex on my thinking, but it creeps in there. So folks may know Pivot. It's a nonprofit legal society that typically works around the rights of people who use drugs, people who experience homelessness or rely on public space, folks that participate in illicit or informal economies, including sex workers, and also people who are vending on the street, things like that, and people who experience police brutality. So criminalization, policing are huge threads that link all of this work. And it linked all of this work before COVID, and it's going to link all of this work after COVID. And here in BC, we've already been working in the context of one public health emergency, the drug poisoning crisis that's killed thousands of people. And of course, like any official public health crises have been predated by centuries of settler colonialism, including land theft and genocide, as well as racist, classist policies that are informed by white supremacy and capitalism. So I'm thinking about racist, classist drug wars. I guess we have the dubious distinction of being the place where the drug wars in Canada started following anti-Chinese riots. I'm also thinking about like the decided and organized abandonment of street-based sex workers, especially women who became missing and murdered Indigenous women and Two-Spirit trans folk and girls. So when we talk about policing the pandemic, I think it's vital that we are clear. COVID-19 is just one pandemic. Every single tool that's being deployed right now has already been tested, foremost on Black, Indigenous, racialized, and poor people. Whether we're talking about just abandoning an entire segment of the community and leaving them to die, but also things like ticketing, fines, snitch lines, and sanctimonious social media posts. Like none of those things are new. We're just all online right now. So yeah, I want to highlight what's new in this moment. And yesterday I was listening to a podcast called Hood Rat to Head Rap. It's done by two Black activists in the States, Erica Hart and Ebony Donnelly. And in their most recent episode, which is like everything about COVID right now, they talked about America and how America is so invested in this idea of like race relations and racial harmony. And obviously America is not unique in that regard. I see parallels in Canada, like hours or days after the public health emergency was announced here, I was invited to like a couple of social media groups like COVID Coming Together, Caremongering Canada, and of course, nightly noise-making demos in support of healthcare, but really nurse doctors. And there was like a groundswell of support for that, right? We have like rainbows in the windows and hearts and all of that stuff. And like, absolutely, I think frontline healthcare workers are doing important work, but they're certainly not the only ones doing important work. And they're certainly not the ones who hold down the community. But it was really interesting here because like all of this came on the heels of like the efforts at shutting down Canada. So the response that was led by Indigenous and Indigiqueer folks who were talking about RCMP invasion on sovereign Wet'suwet'en territory. But suddenly we had this like broader thing that needed to bring us all together, right? We needed to pull our community together and all respond and do mutual aid. And like, I think mutual aid is amazing. Definitely gets messy when folks who haven't done it before are like policing each other, but that's another talk. But yeah, I just think about how like, even in Vancouver, which is like this hippy dippy lotus land, people hated the shutdown Canada stuff, right? Like we had business owners who were like crying about how a blockade shut down access to their fucking like gourmet kitchenware shop. Same people who are now doing curbside pickup, right? Because we're all in it together. So I just wanted to like really take a moment to highlight how these moments are so easily co-opted by narratives of nation building and inequality flattening stories. I'm going to try and get through the next part really quickly, but I think that amidst all of that, right, we're in it together, COVID coming together, we have the city and the province making moves towards reopening infrastructure, which is golf courses and botanical gardens, but also issuing an evacuation order against people who are sheltering in public space. So we have an evacuation order that's been issued against 3 tent cities. Very specific tent cities, 1 in Vancouver, Oppenheimer Park, 2 in Wasonic and Lekwungen territory, so-called Victoria, Topaz and Pandora Park. And these orders are done in the guise of public health, but really they're just a way of deploying displacement tactics against people who rely on public space. So again, you know, this notion of like benevolent government care, and if you had tuned into history since like 1492, you would know what that really means. They're not unique in this moment. So there's no care that comes from a police officer forcing you at gunpoint to leave your home. We have the mainstream media perpetuating this narrative of like, people need haircuts. We need to get back to life as normal. Yet we see which communities are rapidly accepted as collateral damage in the response to COVID. And I think I'm really holding those things in tandem as someone who's housed and experiencing a very privileged kind of COVID-19 like moment. I'm able to keep my job, but I also want to betray that and like really look at like, we're not making noise for peer workers, we're not making noise for drug dealers who are the ones who fucking kept the safe supply going. We're not making noise for sex workers who are denied access to serve. We're making noise for people who make $40 an hour plus. So that's kind of my rant for this morning. Thank you all. Looking forward to the discussion today. And I know I went a little long. I apologize. I'm just passionate.
Thank you, Meenakshi. It's actually okay. We have some extra time today. So I actually wanted to ask you a quick question because me and you had a really interesting conversation about spitting and coughing. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's my passion project at the moment. So we don't have the same regime that I've kind of heard from folks in Ontario where there's like ticketing. Here, police officers can't issue tickets that hasn't been ordered by our public health officer. So we don't necessarily have enforceable physical distancing or things like that. But we do see, again, all the same use of bylaws and policing that predates COVID happening now. So VPD is trying to find new work for itself. And so they want to police people who are spitting. And someone that I work alongside, an Indigenous dude who's well known to the VPD because he hates the cops and isn't quiet about it. He spat on the ground while walking past them, mainly as a way of showing his disdain for what they do and what they do in his community. And again, he spat on the ground. He didn't spit in their faces, but he got taken into cells for a few hours and ultimately was issued like an expectorating ticket, which is, I guess, the academic police term for spitting. And I think that there's this ease, and it's definitely related to racism and classism around what is disgusting and what needs to be shut down right now. So don't know if it's the same in other cities. We're like rife with anti-Asian racism in particular. And so that's always part of like the narratives of like disgust, right? And who is disgusting? And if you are disgusting, you need to be policed in this moment because you're not just gross, you're a public health risk.
Thank you for that. So if people have other questions, we'll put them in the chat and then bring them up at the end. Thanks so much, Meenakshi. And Tave, there was a request that you put the document to the the link to the Know Your Rights document in the chat.
Yeah, I only have it as a Word document, so I'm trying to figure out how to get it.
Oh, okay, cool.
Working on it.
All right, thanks. You saw that. Okay, great. Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, so next up we have Lora McElhinney. Apologies if I pronounce your last name wrong. I have one of those names too. Lora has been working with Joint Effort for 20 years. She has learned from prisoners, elders, and other advocates and activists about what is wrong with the system and is forging relationships with folks inside and around projects of mutual interest. She has witnessed how we can break isolation of the prison system and create better ways of supporting each other. So I'm going to hand it over to Lora.
Thanks so much, everyone. And yeah, I'm talking here from the traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And myself, my name's Lora McElhinney, and my people come from the traditional territories of the Scottish, Irish, and English. And yeah, I've been with Joint Effort for 20 years. Joint Effort's been around for 40 years and, you know, came out of the feminist movement and has aligned with all sorts of people's movements, you know, before that time and through this time. And we really try to, you know, learn from each other's histories and you know, including the support work that our elders in the group have done with, you know, the fight for spiritual freedoms inside prisons for Indigenous folks, bringing in the pipe, the drum, elders, medicines, and that hard-won fight that that John Trudell made the call out for folks in BC to help folks in Kent when they were, you know, in the riots and the hunger strike there. So, and, you know, this continues, and, you know, as well as, you know, kind of looking at things from that linear history, we, you know, have learned and acknowledge, you know, that history is a cycle, history is a circle, and that, you know, as many folks before me on this panel have said, there's, you know, this isn't anything new, this isn't new terrain. You know, we've seen through several generations of genocide and the state institutions of them that that, you know, the state uses every opportunity, including COVID-19, to, you know, advance its position or stave off resistance movements and, you know, traditional Indigenous, you know, not even movements, but assertion of sovereignty and rights. So, yeah, so, you know, so that's the kind of the context that we, you know, work in and challenge ourselves to work in. And as for, you know, what our group has been going through before COVID, you know, we've been going into prisons on and off. We've been barred before, and we're sort of, you know, neoliberally barred now through kill by process policy. But so we were fighting the reliability status that has been brought in for volunteers to go through the same background checks that employees go through, including fingerprinting, histories of employment, landlords going back like 3 places, your associates, and credit checks. So, when we were faced with this, it was a really hard decision because of the impact of the folks we connect with inside, but as well in solidarity with people's movements many of us are part of, other actions on the outside, and in being abolitionists, very important that we not go along with the state becoming even more punitive and have more reaching powers, right? So so we haven't gone through the reliability status and have actually made it a campaign, and to try and bring more attention to it, and to get the policy turned back so that community can have access to its community members inside. As for the policing that's going on inside, we're hearing, through family members, that there's, no COVID-19 measures being taken. I mean, it's even out in the media, that prisoners, aren't being given masks, aren't being given, alcohol or sanitation wipes. Some are given soap, not consistently, but as well, the guards' treatments of folks, has just ramped up. People have been told, like, we're not giving you alcohol sanitation wipes, you're just going to drink it. And, the feeling inside is, just very reminiscent of the blankets coming into villages all over the country with smallpox, and that feeling of, being in, a predominantly Indigenous, population, especially in the prairies and out here, that feeling of, that reminiscent feeling of, not only people aren't paying attention and we're unseen, but that this is, a form of extermination. So, in response, Ann Kelly from the CSC has said, we're doing everything we can. We have these protocols. Well, the guards have been using the masks, the first day they were given them, and then not using them at all. So, in some places, and CSC and, the Parole Board of Canada have been supposedly working on ways of early release and getting people out. But this, it turns out, is not for people inside prisons or jails. This is, for prisons. It's for, people who haven't been, haven't gone to hearing yet. So and many people who have gone before the parole board in the last month have been told flat out, we're not even considering COVID-19, when if you even look on their website, it says this is a consideration. So it's, just complete lies, as we're kind of used to. But the, and people are, as they are often are in the system, very afraid of reprisals. Right now is, people don't know what's happening. People are being, we're being moved from Mission to the Pacific Regional Treatment Center in Abbotsford Matsqui complex to have a sort of health ward there, and then they didn't, and so people don't know, who's coming in and out, but as well, the guards are bringing it in and out as well. So, in terms of, I think that's all my time for now. But yeah, thanks for listening to this. And yeah, just to mention a couple of things we're working on is getting info sheets out to prisoners, to inmate committees, and through programs if possible, and joining the prison justice groups and family members in going to different provincial and federal institutions, as well as detention centers, to make some noise for folks inside, raise spirits, and you know, get the word out. So there's that.
Thank you so much for that update, Laura. Can you send links to the Joint Efforts web presence, if you have that, in the chat?
For sure.
Thank you so much. And if you have other questions, or if people have other questions, just send them to me. I have a quick question for Tave before we move on. There was a Policing the Pandemic local Ottawa discussion that happened last week, and someone presented there about how in Ottawa, shelters have created a centralized banning list for people who they say have been weaponizing coughing, so that people can be centrally banned from day programs and shelters all across Ottawa if they've been perceived of weaponizing coughing. And someone wanted to know if anyone, or if you've heard of anything like this in the Toronto shelter system.
That's horrible. I haven't heard of anything like that in Toronto, but I would not be surprised to hear of that happening here as well.
Okay, thank you. So next, I'm going to pass it on to Dolores Chu, and Dolores is a founding member of the Montreal South Asian Women's Community Center and is a member of women of diverse origins. She teaches history and humanities at Marianapolis College, where she's also the coordinator of the liberal arts program, and she's also a research associate at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute, which is where I went to school. That's cool. Welcome, Dolores.
Thank you so much, Alex, and everybody who's put this fabulous stuff together. And as I was listening, I was thinking this is all so familiar. So also just bear with me as I go through, because I might be repeating some of what is said. I want to say that I'm speaking today from Jojaga, Montreal, which is unceded land of the Gani and Gahaga, the Mohawk people. And one of the earlier speakers mentioned what was going on Wet'suwet'en land. And what amazed me was, you know, there was so much mobilization across the country in support of the Wet'suwet'en people. And on the 8th of March, we had our Women's Day demonstration in Montreal. It was a beautiful sunny Sunday afternoon, and there were about 5,000 people. And right in the front, the Native Women's Association of Quebec led, and it was amazing. And then within a week, everything shut down and we stopped hearing about it. And that's one of the things that's happening now with the pandemic and COVID. It's sort of eclipsing so many other things, but those of us who are involved in communities and grassroots groups, we know that the work continues and the work doesn't get shut down. It just sort of it makes things more difficult, and that's something that's really informed my thoughts as I put together what I wanted to share with you today. That you know, we are located in marginalized communities here, even though, as you know, some of us still enjoy a high degree of privilege, and communities that are marginalized as a result of race, gender, economic inequality. And we've seen historically how these realities get instrumentalized. So even when crises like COVID do present us as opportunities to push for change in areas that we have been working in for so long, and push for change simply because in some cases there's a little more awareness, like you have, you know, people working in elder care who historically have been so exploited, and now suddenly people are hearing a lot more about it. So there are opportunities for us to push for change, but also these are opportunities, and we have to recognize this, for entrenched political and economic power to utilize fear, to utilize, the insecurity that the pandemic has thrown up universally, and use this to entrench greater coercion. So I'm quickly going to speak about several things, and again, bear with me as I'm sort of running around, teacher, historian, etc. So I'm just trying to bring a few things together. I want to start off very quickly talking about 9/11 and lessons learned from 9/11, and then something about how some of the systemic and structural inequalities that exist have been laid bare by the current COVID lockdowns and the scare about the pandemic. Also looking at certain examples from history where, again, as some of the previous people mentioned, Meenakshi was talking about how all of what we're seeing today is not new. And those of us who know these histories, we need to remind people of these histories and how they have been used. And coming again to some realities of today and challenges for us. So my own personal experience comes from many years of working and living here in Georgia, but also being very connected to South Asia, having been born and raised in India and engaged in work for democracy in India and South Asia for many years. I also want to acknowledge that what I know and my experiences have been fed and informed by many others who have contributed to this and continue to contribute to my understanding. So 20 years ago with 9/11, I realized that for quite a lot of younger people, 9/11, happened such a long time ago. For example, I was born 10 years after the end of World War II, but to me, it's always been like, oh, growing up, it was like really, really far away, something that happened a long time ago. So I realized that for many, 9/11 might seem like a long time ago. But looking around with the work that's going on now in terms of the pandemic, a lot of what we learned in that post 9/11 fallout, the way fear was used to garner compliance with policing, greater surveillance, and that sort of better to be safe than sorry mentality, or when basic notions of legal representation got removed with so-called security certificates. It was hard work very often to get people on board to protest against it because of the so-called war on terror, and today it's the war on COVID. But the same sort of othering, the scapegoating that we've just heard about today, and many of us know is going on as well. So drawing on the 9/11 experience, I see it as no accident that a lot of the community work and the political work that's happening today in the COVID-19 context is being done by what I call people who I call the grads of the 9/11 school, who are working on challenging the tyrannical security certificates, the increased surveillance, the arming of the state, imperialist wars. And in turn, some of those were folk who are already active in earlier anti-globalization work and anti-capitalist work. And so there's a kind of continuity of this. And I think this is very rich tradition of experience that's informing what we're doing today, and gatherings like we're part of this afternoon, work on the release of prisoners and those in immigration prisons. So just sort of connecting the past and what's going on today. I think all of you are aware of this amazing historic hunger strike in the immigration prison in Laval that drew a lot of attention, not just to the fact that people were being held in dangerous situations of COVID infection, but some people who didn't even know about these detention centers or these immigration prisons got to know about them. So opportunities. Also looking at who's involved here in Quebec today, or currently in India in terms of the global COVID context, a younger generation. So in Quebec, some of the folk had cut their teeth early on in the so-called Maple Spring and the student strike that galvanized a lot of young people for the first time into political action and analysis and grassroots democracy. And the fearlessness with which they took to the streets day after day, confronting police brutality. And in India, a lot of the work that's going on today, despite the lockdown, is being done by younger people who came out on the streets in historic numbers in terms of political participation and street level participation in India in pushback against the Hindu ethno-nationalist fascist policies of legalizing discrimination and racializing people with the acts that they were passing, and the Citizenship Amendment Act, the National Register of Citizens, and surveillance technology to kind of identify people who didn't quite fit in and who were unclean and contagious. And quite a lot of observers also in India have said that the lockdown with COVID comes naturally to many who have been raised in a very caste society where notions of ritual pollution and contamination have existed for centuries. So using these opportunities to draw attention to systemic and structural inequalities and laying them bare. So inequalities due to capitalism, patriarchy, colonialism, and racism, and always how these systems of hierarchy and inequality are always looking to maximize profits and use whatever opportunity is there to push their own agendas forward. So, we are working to sort of link the surveillance culture and the surveillance state and enhance surveillance with equality rights, some things that we have been working on for a long time. So in this context of COVID, for example, in Canada, the idea that wages would get topped up, and reminding people that the $15 an hour campaign has been going on for a long time, or that people who are unable to find work can apply for federal government funding, whereas social welfare payments in Quebec have been stuck at $690 a month, which is just awful. It's obscene. And we have so many examples. For example, recently we learned about a woman who was on a sort of, had applied for refugee status, and while she was waiting to hear the outcome, she started training as an orderly, but then they eventually threw out of the program saying, you don't know, your literacy rate is too low. And then now, with the need for caregivers in elder care institutions, she's actually being called and she's going to be paid, she's being offered $24 an hour. So what we see is that systems accommodate, and it's for us to use these opportunities to push heightened awareness. Being involved with the South Asian Women's Community Center and linked to other women's groups also, the issue of violence against women, which is endemic. But again, in this situation of lockdown, what does it mean? And again, you do have government ministers, etc., talking about this. So these are opportunities to say that this is always there, and how can we use this greater awareness to push for change? And generally, from the perspective of groups that I work with, involved in essential care work in the so-called private sphere, the gendered work historically is devalued. And now in the time of crisis, we see these fault lines where, government ministers, etc., are talking about the guardian angels and how much we owe to the frontline workers. But who are these frontline workers? They're often either migrant workers or newly arrived racialized people from racialized communities, a lot of women involved in caregiving, in food production, in distribution. And the slogan "Good enough to work, good enough to stay" is so relevant now. So again, opportunities that exist. Also, looking at the current crisis and the class lines and the fault lines, when India was just about to go into lockdown, and some of you already know this, the government declared it, and within 4 hours, they declared it at 8 p.m. one night, and by midnight, it was happening, and people were stranded wherever they were. You probably heard about the thousands of people walking hundreds of kilometers to get back to their villages because they had no place to stay as migrant workers. Somebody commented that, for example, in the city of Bombay, COVID arrived with people coming on planes and spread to crowded slum areas. So people in those areas could never ever get on a plane, but they were being affected by this global pandemic. And again, evidence from communities on the ground here, inequalities and lockdowns definitely affect the most vulnerable. Those without buffers, financial buffers or social buffers, and a heightened racial profiling. So when we're all told to socially distance, which is really physically distancing, if you're in housing that is already inadequate, where two families might be sharing a 3-bedroom apartment, and where there's gentrification going on, or in India, where daily wage earners no longer have a source of living, or other parts of the world, including here, where you're laid off, it creates a huge vulnerability. And government decrees that actually force this vulnerability even further. So in Quebec, for example, people who are not directly involved in healthcare but are classified as health workers, so speech language pathologists, etc., government decree basically said that you are all going to be deployed, and people have been given barely 1 hour of training and thrown into environments which are really dangerous for their health. Even if they have medical certificates saying that they have a health condition, they are being told literally, if you don't show up, you're going to be fired. So government decrees, and they're being sort of manipulated and told, like, don't you care for your fellow human being, and what is this? So the way things can be forced onto people, and the power of the state used in very oppressive ways. On the ground in India, I've already mentioned casteism, which is very much alive and well, but Islamophobia, so this idea of contagion, that there are certain communities that are infected and will spread infection, and terms like COVID jihad being used to further attack communities which have been under genocidal attacks for several decades, but most recently December, January, etc. We also need to recognize the tremendous amount of solidarity work that is being done in very difficult circumstances, mobilizing funds for food to literally stop people from starving. Some of the daily wage earners that I've mentioned already in India, people losing their homes because they cannot afford to pay rent, and so on. And again, just a kind of linear connection going back in history. I think probably everybody in this webinar is very familiar with the Komagata Maru, the ship that was docked off Vancouver in 1914. And there was a lot of rampant racism and yellow press, etc. But they were also, the passengers in the ship were also sort of described as carriers of contagious or loathsome diseases, and therefore could be denied entry under the immigration law. So apart from the racist continuous journey clause that the government of Canada introduced, there was this idea of contagion and spread. And today we have the same things with the tax on people of East Asian, Southeast Asian origin. In Montreal, Buddhist temples have been defaced. The lion statues at the gates in Chinatown have been defaced as well. And there have been attacks in other parts of Canada also against people who seem to visibly be of Chinese or Chinese-like origin. I'm a teacher of history, and sometimes it's sort of difficult to convey to students how things might happen. And one of the big questions always when you look at Germany in the 1930s and the 40s and what were the German people doing, we just have to sort of look around us at this time of COVID pandemic and the kind of rise in vigilante violence, or as we've been hearing today, and it's become common knowledge, the sort of policing and orders that come from above, and then the interpretation on the ground where people can get rounded up and ticketed. And I think in the last webinar that Policing the Pandemic had, we heard from a street worker in Montreal who said that she was being ticketed for giving out flyers to Indigenous people who were living on the streets in Montreal. Friends of Indian origin have told me how they have been verbally assaulted by people on the street here. And this is an upscale neighborhood that they live in because they were out for their daily walk with their two sons, and they're all a very tall family, so the sons are very tall, and they were basically assaulted and blamed for spreading disease. So the sort of atmosphere that's created that give people sort of the right or feel entitled to spew racist violence, things that might be there below the surface and then become legitimized. And some of us who've been involved in the anti-Bill 21 campaigns here, where you might be familiar with this, where women, well, they say people with wearing visible religious symbols cannot work in public spaces, etc. So largely directed to Muslim women who wear the hijab and who are school teachers or work as prosecutors, etc. So suddenly when the Quebec government talks about solidarity in this time of COVID, the same prime minister and government who passed this law, we say, what kind of solidarity are you talking about? You know, on the one hand, it's okay to talk about solidarity, but on the other hand, you legislated bigotry and inequality. So we need to call this out and make the links. And there are many other historic examples, you know, again, going to colonial India, late 19th, 20th century, the spread of plague and how colonial officials went in to households and, you know, racist incidents, and also with parallels that the poor, the rural poor, were the ones who were most targeted, and migrants at that time, late 19th, early 20th century in India, having to walk hundreds of kilometers, very, very similar to what's happening today. Or the Contagious Diseases Act in the 19th century in Britain and the colonies, you know, again, identifying sources of contagion. And who were these sources? They were largely poor women in precarious situations. So I know I'm running out of time, and I'll just conclude by saying that a couple of things. One is it's really important to not allow concerns about public health to get instrumentalized by surveillance, and to challenge this hegemony of fear and, you know, better to be safe than sorry. I have friends who say that they're afraid to go out without a mask because they feel they will be attacked. I myself, personally, I suffer from terrible allergies, and every morning when I wake up, I'm sneezing and I have to use lots of tissues. But I tend to go out for grocery shopping at 7 a.m. because that's when senior citizens can go, and I'm just afraid of blowing my nose or sneezing because people might say, well, you shouldn't be here. And I know very well that this is something that happens to me every day. It's happened before COVID. So the sense of fear and uncertainty and the license that others might have for policing individuals. And so the public health shouldn't get instrumentalized, and how can we, another point, how can we mobilize the heightened awareness that is emerging because of systemic and structural inequalities, so that the so-called guardian angels are the ones who have been historically exploited? Okay? How can we push for more permanent change, and that once the pandemic eases, whenever that is, it will not be going back to business as usual? Because again and again, you know, communities of struggle, activism, etc., we tend to get sort of pushed aside when things improve. So how can we keep this momentum and tell governments who historically have said, well, you know, we can't spend on X, Y, and Z because of austerity, etc. And now we see there's money that is available because you have to save this system, this capitalist system. So historically, we see in moments of crisis opportunities, and how can we ensure that these opportunities make for progressive change? So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your words, Dolores. Really appreciate that. I have two questions for you from the chat. One is, thank you for highlighting the historical roots of the rise of authoritarianism that we're seeing today. Are there histories of resistance that would also be useful for us to keep in mind in the present moment as well? I'll ask that one, and then I'll ask you the other one afterwards.
So definitely, I mean, I talked about, you know, the 9/11 and the post 9/11 organizing that happened, that many of us here in Montreal and Quebec and other parts of Canada were involved with, and they really fed into ongoing activism. And many of the people involved, either in community solidarity work here or in work that has looked at migrant justice over the past several years, or, you know, housing, are those of us who kind of got our experience, got our teeth, etc., in these earlier struggles. So learning how to organize, how to push, how to lobby, how to mobilize. So just from the last couple of decades, or I mentioned the spring, the maple spring over here, and in India, young people cutting their political teeth in the last couple of years against Hindu ethno-nationalism, and using those skills and abilities and techniques to work now. So I definitely think that's important, and we can see the signs, and we can go back centuries also, but more recently, yeah.
Okay, and another one was that you mentioned the immigration detention hunger strike, and people were wondering if you could give an update about that, and maybe also a bit of background for people who don't know.
Yeah, and when I'm finished in the chat, I'll put the link to Solidarity Across Borders, because this whole movement was bottom line by Solidarity Across Borders, who have been working dedicatedly for several decades now. So many of the people involved in Solidarity Across Borders were involved in the issues of the abrogation of civil liberties in the post 9/11 context, and security certificates, and coming out of that. Solidarity Across Borders, and I don't want to represent them because I'm not involved. We are involved in solidarity collaboration with them. Visit in Laval, which is a suburb north of Montreal City. There's a large immigration prison, and they do regular visitation, and people who are detained there who have no other contacts. And sometimes at the South Asian Women's Community Center, we help with interpretation. So somebody will call in for a Bengali speaking person, and so on. So with the pandemic and the demands, universal demands about people being released from prisons and incarceration generally, there was also the concern of people detained in Laval. And then when it came out that one of the guards in Laval was infected, things really sort of exploded. And then some of the people themselves who were detained decided that they were going to go on hunger strike. And so solidarity actions were mobilized, going outside the prison, making noise, and the people detained there said it was just so amazing to know that they were not alone. Press conferences and social media mobilization, the press picked it up and it became very well known, and gradually people were released. So so I'll put some links up, and that's in a way there's ongoing work happening with that.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dolores. If people have other questions, let's just put them in the chat. And I think Aziz just put a link to Solidarity Across Borders,
Okay.
And some more information.
Okay.
So next, I'm going to pass it on to Hamid Khan. And Hamid is a campaign coordinator for the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition in Los Angeles. And Hamid, I have your image, and also I can screen share for showing the website. So just let me know whenever you want me to do that throughout, and I'll just start screen sharing. I'll hand it over to Hamid now.
All right. Great. Thank you. And good morning, everybody. Greetings from Los Angeles, from Long Beach. I want to honor that we're on Tongva land, and sort of day-to-day engagement and continuing to build this culture of resistance in Los Angeles as the national security police state further tightens its grip and further expands its powers and further expands the police state that we've been living in. The work of the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, I'll just give a very brief snapshot, is really rooted in the abolition of the police state, but looking at it particularly through the lens of how counterinsurgency and counterterrorism tactics are a part and parcel of policing in the United States. And I say that in a sense that much has been said already by other speakers, but some of the values that drive our work and inform our work is number one, that this is not a moment in time, but a continuation of history. So although this has already been raised by folks, but what is that continuation of history, and what is this moment in time also is necessary for us to constantly look at, because as we are having this conversation, the police state is reconfiguring itself as well. So so I think that is something also a continuing of history too. So in a sense, when we look at this and we use the term public health crisis, we're also reminded that, and particularly the location for Stop LAPD Spying Coalition is right in the thick of the Skid Row community in downtown Los Angeles, which is one of the largest concentration of unhoused population, over 85% Black, extremely poor. I mean, just an encampment that exists. So in a sense, the notion of public health crisis was a pre-existing condition for many communities in LA. Not just because of where people were living, what was the access to services, but when you look at the whole, and in the US, the healthcare system, again, the crisis was that millions and millions of people don't even have access to quality healthcare. So in a sense, this whole continuation of history is a part and parcel of for us. So now, again, we are dropped with this emergency, which has further exacerbated a lot of situations that we are living in. Secondly, when we talk about not a moment in time, we continue to see the disproportionate impact of COVID, as it has always been, on the Black, Indigenous, Brown, and poor communities. So that continues to be not a moment in time, but a continuation of that history. And we are seeing that how these communities are being disproportionately impacted as a result of COVID. And thirdly, while there's a whole lot, I would say that once again, we see ourselves policing our way out of the problem. That the way we are looking at these issues is not, and I think we all, and I think this is the underlying theme that I'm also hearing that is weaved through a lot of speakers' comments as well, that once again, we are being forced to surrender ourselves to the needs of the national security police state. Once again, we are being forced into a position where an emergency has been created, a threat to our life has been put out there, and of course it's similar to 9/11, as that was stated earlier as well. But there's a whole bunch of moments that we look at. So in a sense, what is our role and what is our culture of resistance, and what is being stated right now? So what is our fight? So I think one of the things for the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition is to constantly monitor the expansion of the police state and the police powers, and looking at it through a historic lens, not going far back, because if I was to start drawing it, and it's all posted on our website too, surveillance and public health has been a primary tool of the police state forever. Public health has been deployed, and in that, surveillance has is an elementary tool for public health itself, as to who can have access, who can participate, who can move freely, who can have access to services, and who has rights for full citizenship, if you will. So I think, in a sense, we're looking at these issues through these lenses. And I'm also reminded, by looking at the history of surveillance too, that going back to early 1700s in New York City, there were these laws called lantern laws. And lantern laws were laws which were passed around 1706, 1707, where if you were an enslaved body, a Black or an indigenous enslaved body, and if you were walking out without a master, you had to walk with a lantern to self-identify yourself as a threat to the system, to self-identify yourself as a hostile. So, which brings me to the second sort of value that we bring to our work, that there's always an other. There's always this justification, there's always this hostile, there's always this threat, and at least through the settler colonial, patriarchal, white supremacist capitalist system, we look at it like how faces have been paraded. So what would it mean in this current term? So for example, the assignment of criminality and how communities have been pathologized. So the face of the savage native, the face of the criminal Black, the face of the illegal Latino, the face of the manipulative Asian, the face of the terrorist Muslim, the face of the deviant trans. So now, in a sense, how that whole history is going to play out, because one of the things is this very coded language that we are hearing is this language of predisposition and susceptibility. So for example, that Black people have predisposition to a particular disease, and so now COVID becomes another issue. Black people have high levels of susceptibility to these factors, without looking at the real issues of how public health itself, as a tip of the knife, has over centuries really created conditions for Black people and various other communities as well, living on the margins, where they've never had access to healthy food, never had access to healthy healthcare systems, and access to that as well. So I don't want to take too much time, because I would love to hear what people have to say, but just to give you a snapshot, and Alex, if you don't mind pulling up the stalker state chart, because a lot of stuff we are hearing right now is about syndromic surveillance and serological surveillance and sentinel surveillance and various other forms of surveillance as well. So in a sense, how would our data move? So when we talk about rejecting, and what would this contact tracing look like? Because with contact tracing and contact tracer, now the similarity comes down to see something, say something. So now, as somebody was saying, so we're sort of like this culture of snitching. The culture of calling out, the culture of demonizing the other, whether Dolores is out in the morning and has to sneeze, because I have allergies too. So I totally hear you, sister. This is something like, what the fuck? We can't even sneeze anymore. So in a sense, how our lives are being traced and tracked and monitored. So we call it the stalker state. So in a sense, if I was to put my cursor, how information moves. So think of this as not just as a static Venn diagram, but a lot of this as, active, live, intersecting circles. So how information moves from public sector to private sector to social media to law enforcement agencies, international agencies, which in a sense, like closing of the borders, what does that mean? And which is also no coincidence that the top 5 partnering countries in these international surveillance schemes they're called the 5 Eyes, which is the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. That how they operate. So now when we talk about information sharing and when we are told that, well, I mean, that contact tracing is going to just basically be a process of identifying people so other people can be informed and can be protected. The question really becomes, given the history of data collection and given the history of the expansion of the police state, where would that stop? So that's one piece. The second piece is the further deployment, a constant deployment of social network analysis. So that is something that we also have to look at, because that is a tool that gets weaponized quite a bit to go after people, to identify people. So in a sense, how are people even speaking to each other? What would the deployment of social network analysis look like by law enforcement agencies? So every time we are talking to somebody, the understanding is, or the estimates are, that one person becomes a conduit for 100,000 people. That's the metadata. One person has 10 friends, each one of those 10 friends has 10 friends, and they have additional 10 friends. So the multiplier effect that who gets nabbed into this system is very large, is very large as well. So I think I again would rather just stop there. I don't want to take too much time, but just wanted to share this piece with you all, that at least the way we have been building our culture of resistance has been to be, and of course, besides the food distribution that is happening in Skid Row, where one of the bigger challenges is that starvation is setting in as well, because accessibility to healthy food, where there were already food deserts, how that is going to play out, and secondly, what lays ahead, like just not post COVID, because a lot of hearing different people say different things. I think we're in this for a long haul. But then how would this, in a sense, when we are talking about contact tracing, when we are talking about smartphones, when we're talking about Bluetooth technology, that how these would become almost like ankle monitors and electronic monitors that are being used to trace and track and monitor people. And if you can quickly throw up the other one also, Alex, on the screen, I just want to show folks. So if you can scroll it down, this is basically the architecture of surveillance. And if you slowly scroll it down, so there's a whole process of how information gets gathered. Fusion centers become central information gathering places. It's on the website too, so please feel free to go through that. Suspicious activity reporting program, which was with the see something, say something. So how behavior is constantly being policed, what would that look like? The iWatch program of see something, say something. And now, as a threat to the system, the intelligence gathering guidelines, where police can take on fictitious persona and fake identities. We're looking at already predpol and predictive algorithms now being incorporated into into the fight back against COVID as well. Trapwire happens to be a street-style camera that basically picks up our body image at night through thermal imaging. So our movement when we are walking in the street is being monitored as well. Stingray is a device that mimics our cell phone towers, so traces and tracks and identifies our phone conversations. Digital receiver technology is something that is a Stingrays on steroids that can also gather information if your phones are shut down as well. License plate readers, high definition cameras, body cameras. So in a sense, and then drones are being deployed as well. So I think when we talk about this militarization of the police, and when we talk about the expansion of the national security police state, the playbook is always there. The playbook has been there. The playbook is constantly being built upon. So then what is our challenge? What is our fight back? What is our defense? And I think that's where our own community education and community outreach becomes really critical. These conversations are absolutely instrumental in helping folks understand and recognize as to where things are going. So I'll stop there and would love to hear as to what people are thinking of and how do we continue building this culture of resistance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hamid. So I have a couple questions for you. One of them first was about looking, Well, we've had questions in Ontario, the province of Ontario, the most populous province in Canada, around data sharing with police. And police now have access to a list of anyone who's tested COVID positive. And on the Toronto Transit Commission, the largest public transportation system in the country, in Canada, because of that mechanism, and I think because of transit police, all bus drivers got a message on April 14th, I believe, or April 4th, saying, do not pick up this woman, indicated that she was Black and said that she was COVID positive and homeless, and also had some other identifying information. It was posted on social media, which is how it came to light, and the public transportation system apologized for it. But I was wondering if, in terms of, you kind of thought really clearly about how data flows and how data flows between different things and who has access to data. I was just wondering if you had any reflections on that, or someone in the chat was wondering if you had reflections on how data moves across agencies, and if you could reflect on that from your perspective.
Right. And I think that's what one of the reasons to project that Stalker state chart was, that how information moves in real time within various systems. But I think before we get into contact tracing and whether police should have data or not, I think we also have to come to an agreement that what has been the role of the police. So from our vantage point, at least in Los Angeles, the sole purpose of the police, and I say that very clearly, categorically, is the intent to cause harm to many communities. So I think they lie, they're violent, they're murderous, they would do anything to pathologize, to demonize, to assign criminality. So now this data becomes a major repository for the future as well, and they would go to the extent, it's the same police that up until 40 years ago, and more even recently as well in South Central Los Angeles, if there was a call for service and if there was a domestic violence issue or anything else, their report would say no humans involved, because they would categorically state that about Black folks and other folks as well, that no. So now when you're looking at the mentality of an institution that was built on slave patrols, that was built on recovery of human body as property, which basically was self-stealing because they were trying to get free, so that these institutions are very much informed by that. So I think for us, we have to really just take a deep breath and say, like, okay, here again, in the 9/11 moment, as was stated earlier by Dolores and other folks as well, that we are being asked this whole choice between safety and security. But this one is very clear that, and that's why history becomes important as well. Because even in moments which is not a crisis, so let's look at the 1984 Olympics, what happened in Los Angeles. The 84 Olympics was a classic moment which resulted in massive expansion and the militarization of the Los Angeles Police Department, where under the guise of safety for the Olympics, and that never ended, that further kept on expanding. So in a sense, whether it's a real crisis or a real event or a concocted crisis, I would say, was the whole, this concoction of the meth epidemic in South Central Los Angeles in the 1980s and the supposedly gang warfare. And that's where we saw Hillary Clinton bringing up super predators, and then Donald Trump talking about his death sentence because of wilding of 5 young Black men in Central Park. And then Joe Biden, who's running for president, was the head of the Judiciary Committee, passing these major laws by hiring 100,000 more police and all of that, which was all a concocted thing. So in a sense, I would argue that please, we have to really rethink very seriously whether we want to share our data with these murderous institutions, which would lie in a minute and would use that and not only use that to trace and track, but to take it further to manipulate and blackmail with the intent to banish and intimidate communities as well.
Thank you for that. I have another question about how the Stalker state map that we showed, that you've developed, how that was developed, what research was put into that to create it, because people are interested in the idea of replicating that other places. So kind of if you could give us a background of your methodology about how that was developed.
Certainly. So the first thing, if you want to go back to it this way, if I can just quickly do a snapshot of that too. So the first thing that we developed was, if you look in the center, the center circle, which also sort of mimics the website as well, was to do a bunch of research on the LAPD's architectural surveillance. Like, okay, because we're focusing on the Los Angeles Police Department, the second or the third largest PD in the country. Let's look at this PD and see what sort of various systems does it have. And then, because we live in a police state, and policing our way out of all our social problems is the primary intent of the state. So then we started looking at it like, what surrounds that. So in essence, just a little story that how these circles came about. Myself and two of my comrades, Jamie Garcia and Mariela Saba, were on our way to a convening at the Highlander Center, which is a historic place in Tennessee, where Malcolm and where Dr. King and various other folks would go and organize, where also Pablo Freire and various other folks would come, and became a hub for really just the operationalization of the pedagogy of the oppressed and various other political education and public education. And so on our way, we started drawing these circles on cocktail napkins. And so it kind of generated that conversation from there on our flight from LA to Nashville, Tennessee. And then what we did was we took these and kept those napkins and brought them with us. And next day took some butcher paper and started drawing. And that's when we started like kind of playing with that, okay, well, the information moves like dramatically within various systems. So for example, the DMV, Department of Transportation, or if you go to the Department of Motor Vehicle in Los Angeles, what will happen is the minute you enter there, so we did some further research. And the research was that, okay, where does the information move? And even up to immediately the Canadian, what is that mountain? Rocky? No, I'm thinking of Rocky Mountain. The Mounties. So even the information is immediately shared through Interpol to the Canadian Mountains as well, under the guise of people skipping child support and things like that. So when we started mapping that out, we're like, dang, this is a deep. I mean, when we talk about deep state, that's exactly how it runs. So it is something like it's a work in progress. We are in the process of bringing this to life through a public health lens as well, because public health is the tip right now, and it always has been, but even more right now, a tip of the stalker state, how that is going to move, what are the various agencies that its information is being shared, and how much is it moving. So, I would be happy to talk about it more in detail, because I know time is limited right now. So I'm happy to just folks, if you want to pass them our information, stoplapdspying.org. That'll be, just gmail.com.
Just so time isn't really that limited. We now have, I think, about or 20 minutes that we have just for conversation. So feel free to not be worried about time. And people are sending me lots of questions. One was that the stalker state map seems quite overwhelming. And so what would you say are your kind of top 3 targets to start addressing responding to the stalker state?
So it's sort of like a grouping of targets as well in this, because obviously law enforcement becomes one of the primary focus of how we look at it, and just so that by itself opens it up to a whole lot of partners within that. Because I think, for example, one of the things that we are seeing over time, and that's one of the biggest dangers down the line around where monies are going to go, that how police has been moving in and reconfiguring themselves as social workers. And just in a sense where, particularly with communities who are unhoused, particularly communities who are going through addictions, particularly communities who are going through various other forms of state violence and the violence of the public health system. So all of a sudden we see police as reconfiguring themselves as social workers. So what would that network look like? So it opens up more windows to examine, okay, what are these partnerships looking like? Now, police is taking on the role of public health workers. right? So as a way, like, what would that partnerships look like, and with whom? So with the Department of Sanitation, various hospitals, so the Department of Social Work, the public health institutions as well. So law enforcement as a central theme, because of the nature of the national security police state, that is always our number one target, because that's how we examine. But along with that is also the public sector, and in the private sector, you're looking at social media and various other agencies as well, because social network analysis is a primary tool, particularly going after young people. So how youth are being traced and tracked and monitored, how youth are being criminalized and demonized by doing this whole follow-up of social networking, how they're speaking to each other. There have been several cases, Operation Crew Cut in New York and various other places, where the conversations over social media have been used to criminalize the youth, to go after young people as well. So I would say, these are just, although these are huge apparatuses, but in a sense, it is definitely overwhelming, and I think we should be overwhelmed. I would even say that, in a sense. So for us to then take a step back and say, well, no, I think we can all collectively try to navigate through that. So I think it's a process of bringing our own experiences together collectively, and that's what collective knowledge exchange looks like. And in that building of that culture of resistance, that wherever, because there's so much sort of brilliance and knowledge, this just hearing people on this webinar as well, that just by collectively pooling in knowledge and understanding of these structures, you'd be surprised that that how many aha moments are people going to have, like, oh no shit, this is right in front of me, staring at me. So how do we bring it together, and what's our fight? So it informs our fight and our defense quite a bit that way.
Great, thank you. Another question is, what do you see as a relationship, or what relationship do you see between the Stalker State and the Five Eyes Agreement?
So basically, the Stalker State feeds into the Five Eyes. I mean, like, just in a sense, not just about the movement of people across borders, or the movement of, because I think one of the things we have to start thinking about it, that while COVID is clearly there, I mean, the ecological disaster that has been going on, and the environmental disaster that has been going on, leading up to mass displacement of people and mass environmental refugees and ecological refugees as a result. So what information exchange, information sharing is happening between these 5 countries as well, and how does it affect movement of the people? How is information and intelligence sharing, monitoring and tracing and tracking movement of people is going on as well? So that is one. Secondly, just exchange of other types of how infrastructurally things are being developed as well. So for example, we're looking at right now that what is the exchange going on between New Zealand and Australia, that in Australia, when Google and Apple launched their app 4 days ago, immediately 1.2 million people, and now 3.5 million people have downloaded that. So what is that information sharing and information exchange going on? So between the Five Eyes, it's not just about information sharing. We have to look at these various other forms of corporate information sharing and profit-making information sharing, which the state protects and secures, is also happening as well. So it's very layered, and it runs very deep. And it's not only limited to the supposedly the protection of the border and the movement of people across border. It is a much more in-depth. And I think this is where we have to kind of just look at that, what sustains and maintains the white supremacist settler colonial states. I mean, because that's exactly when you identify, you have US and Canada and New Zealand and Australia into the mix, and UK, which is central to the creation of these settler colonial states as the metropole. So how is this preserving a white supremacist system of control and dominance, and both cultural imperialism and economic imperialism, how that plays out?
Thank you for that. I have a question for both Dolores and Hamid. Do you have any reflections on lessons learned or lessons lost in relation to organizing and strategizing that were drawn from the way that 9/11 was used to push through more repressive measures and policies in the current context with how COVID is being mobilized in similar ways?
I think you're muted, Dolores.
Dolores, you're muted.
Yeah. I love these sessions because they force me to be reflective, and I have to say that I'm always sort of doing and not being reflective enough. So lessons learned, I think very generally I could say that for a lot of people 9/11 happened 2 decades ago, and it's sort of gone into the past. So for those of us who were alive and active then, I think the lesson is to keep kind of reminding people of what we did and what we learned and how it's so relevant to today, to keep on, and also constantly making the links. So 9/11, in some ways, okay, it was the war on terror. This is a healthcare crisis, and to some extent, in some ways, the healthcare crisis has brought a lot of strange bedfellows together. So you have like the Premier of Quebec talking about solidarity when just a few months ago he legislated bigotry and racism. And so the lessons are to keep on kind of reminding people that not to just get so subsumed under a current crisis, to forget that there are systemic links to what is happening. And those are the things that we can do because we have the analysis, and we've worked on developing ways of bringing these forward.
Yeah, for us, I mean, there's quite a bit, but I think, of course, looking at, but I think one of the things that I would lift is that how did it further strengthen our resolve in our journey towards abolition? And how it constantly affirmed that, why abolition is necessary and why reform would never work. So in that, what we started looking was identifying people that we really have to expose and push back within our own movements. So for example, in the context of surveillance, one of our biggest challenges and pushback, and really that we have to fight back as groups like the ACLU, nonprofit law firms, which really becomes instruments of the state in continuing to push a reform and sanitize, in a sense, the fight that people on the ground are constantly fighting back. So there have been so many times that we have exposed them in backdoor negotiation with the state, in like pushing these reformist policies for transparency and accountability. So just in full disclosure, because the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition rejects any form of legislation and regulatory oversight of surveillance, absolutely. Because for us, it's critical, as in our journey towards abolition, that we have to recognize that inherently any police reform would be inherently anti-Black and anti-Indigenous to begin with. Because if we are going to reform an instrument of the state, which is a tip of the knife, that has been the result of mass murder of people and mass trauma to the communities and reform, then our fight really has to be towards abolition. So I think one of the things in the immigrant rights movement, that how we went from from 1986, Reagan's reform of Immigration Reform and Control Act, into down to where the foundation. So I think the other thing that we've started looking at identifying as a threat to our movement building are the foundations. That how foundations pour in millions and millions and millions of dollars, who then circle back. And so the whole nonprofit industrial complex by itself. So I think there's much to be said about the external threat, which is always there. We know that. But I think it's always challenging and difficult to navigate the threats within, as to, what are the various fights that we are fighting back? What are the various institutions that have been which are very sort of white privileged and driven by the white gaze itself? Because if we are here and if we agree that the function of the police and the surveillance is to police race and poverty and suspect bodies, then we have to, then how that is being done is being through the white supremacist gaze. So I think these are the institutions that were created under the pretext of privacy and invasion of privacy, where I would argue that many of our communities have never had that. That's a very white privileged space to begin with. So our fight is really about that, how if we are, that our bodies, so that's why our fight is about, like, we're not there to clean up dirty data, because there's a lot of conversation about only if we were in control of creating these systems, only if we were in control of cleaning up the data. Well, Hamid Hussain Khan, immigrant from Pakistan, organizing against national security police state. I'm a dirty data. So I'm not, my fight is not to clean up my data and to engage in any form of appeasement. My fight is to really just like using my experiences and helping build that culture of resistance. So it's a lot of lessons learned, but that's a whole conversation by itself at some other time. But thank you for asking that.
I have another question for you, Hamid, which is about understanding the public health surveillance or stalker state. And so you mentioned that you're looking at developing a map in relation to that. Someone was wondering if you could talk to that. And also in relation to that, what would community alternatives to something like contract tracing be? And if you have any thoughts on that, or if any of the other speakers do as well.
Right. I mean, I think this is where I would go back to that, that the bane of technology and the weaponization of technology, what has it done to us over time? So I think and of course, I don't have all the answers to that. I can only just sort of like, as we are building that, what are some of the alternatives that we can look at? So for example, one of the things, and Dolores was speaking about South Asia. I mean, I grew up in Pakistan myself. My initial formal education is all from Pakistan. But I think in the whole fight around eradication of tuberculosis, eradication of malaria, eradication of various other infectious diseases that have pre-existed, COVID is not the first one that the humanity is facing. I think a lot of that, and I come from a family where, my grandma was a social worker in Pakistan as well. And in a sense, looking at that, what was community education like? What was community outreach like? And how communities within their own local setting, for example, mahalla by mahalla. So mahalla is a word in Urdu or Punjabi that is used as a local locality, the local neighborhood. So how local neighborhood based were these community education system where people didn't have, there was no technology, there was no internet, there was nothing of that. And I'm going to age myself, that goes back several decades. So in a sense that, so what was the understanding of and the worth of community education, and building that community with each other as well, not snitching and running to the local police station and saying, see, that person has malaria. It was rather that, okay, what do we need to do about it? What does comfort look like? What is access to resources, and what we do need, and what are the limited resources that the community has within itself that it can also share as well? Again, don't want to romanticize anything. It's not like, it's like abolition, that there is no delete button. It's a journey, and it's a multi-generational journey that we happen to be in our time right now towards that journey of abolition. But it's really about like thinking and rethinking that in a sense that when we speak about abolition, it's not about destruction. It's about recreating life-affirming institutions. It's recreating life-affirming, just environments within our community as well. So there's definitely people are looking at alternatives. Communities are looking at alternatives as well. So that's one piece. The other piece, so I think the alternatives to content is one of many. But I think what we have right now is really very draconian in the long run, and it can have a lot of dire impact on our lives. The second question, I'm so sorry, again, I forgot, Alex, what was that?
Oh, I'm muted. The second one was about the development of a public health version of the soccer.
Right. So that is really a work in progress, in a sense that we are right now looking at, so even something, not just the structural identification and mapping of the stalker state and the public health in the public health context, but also, so for example, I go to Skid Row every Wednesday and Sunday for food distribution. So what we do see over there is that there were already these testing that was happening. So now the question is that people who may be asymptomatic, who are maybe testing positive, where are they taking them? Right? So now what sort of this sub-infrastructure is being built, in a sense, as a way to provide care for people? Are they going into hotels? Are they going into shelters? Are they going, so shelters by themselves can become a petri dish for the spread of this virus as well. But for us, it's not just limited to that, because now public health is in motion. Our follow-up is going to be that, is this a tactic for a banishment of community members from Skid Row? Because one of the things that is ever present is the land developers and land speculators. One of the things that ever present is gentrification. So this is an ideal moment for developers and gentrifiers to really use this as an excuse to clean up our neighborhoods, to sanitize our neighborhoods, to get rid of those unwanted and undesirable, and to kind of just, and then to sort of like, rebuild and invest in massive development of real estate as well. So in a sense, public health, not just as a way, because it's all intersectional, and that's what the Stalker State does, provides us an opportunity to think intersectionally as well, that it's not just about like what treatment and in that sense of what tracking and tracing is going to happen, but in a sense, who else also has their fingers into the pot as well? So what is the political leadership thinking? And so we also filed for a lot of public records. So right now, as it is, we've already filed an extensive FOIA and public records for the LAPD to find out what sort of communications are going on between them and the city leadership. We want emails, we want everything. We want minutes of your meetings. We want to know that what sort of conversations are happening between the city and private enterprise and private interest as well. Because I think in a way, helping us map out and chart as to what is on the move becomes really critical. So it's not just public health as we know it per se, but it's everything that surrounds it as well.
Thank you so much. So I have a question from all of the speakers, which is related to ongoing dialogues around countering all of the things that we were addressed today. And one of the organizers was interested to know what would be topics that you would like to see us focus on for the next series of dialogues. So if any, popcorn style, if any of the other speakers have things that they are interested in for us to focus on.
Meenakshi here. I think some connections from like disability justice organizers who have previously talked about the harms of policing. So in the comments I shared a very complex graphic that Mia Mingus put up on her website about the medical industrial complex. And I think there's a lot to learn from like how folks living with disabilities, including people who have been psychiatrized, could inform like how we respond to policing this pandemic.
Thank you for that. Anyone else? Okay, if there isn't, Stephen Mulder mentioned, I love some discussion about emerging strategies for policy advocacy related to COVID and law enforcement. Okay, great. Thank you, Stephen. And so there's just 3 minutes left. So if anyone is interested in remaining connected to the ongoing dialogues, you can send an email to policingthepandemic@gmail.com. The next one will be May 23rd. I want to say thank you to Hamid, to Dolores, to Lora, to Meenakshi, to Tave, to Shane, and also especially to Aziz, to Katerina, to Jane and Colin for helping coordinate and organize this. An excellent conversation again. Thank you so much to everybody. Much love and solidarity to you all. And a video recording of this, a number of people have asked, will be going on YouTube, and we'll send out a link to everybody. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.